Welcome to our third lecture in the series of Historical Geography in the Holy Land. So today's presentation will be all about King Herod the Great and his building projects and the impact that they had within the Holy Land. So Herod the Great is an Idumean, and he was first given rule of Galilee in 41 before the Common Era by Mark Antony. Then later on, under Caesar Augustus and Octavian, he was given rule of Judea, Samaria, and Galilee. He remained in power until 4 BCE, and it's understood and believed that Christ was born in Bethlehem actually prior to that date. Now, King Herod the Great built extensively. He was very generous in his expenditures, and as a result, we have extensive archaeological evidence to support what he did and the roles that he played and the type of individual that he was. It helps supports the reports that we have of him. In Matthew chapter 2, verse 1, it talks about the buildings that he did. So we have here the image of Herod the Great and Herod's family tree. Herod had 4 wives, and you can see the wives and the children, his various sons. He would eliminate his wives when they didn't prove to be politically expedient to have. He did similar things with also his sons. He was an interesting character. Now, the historian Josephus provides us with an extensive record of Herod, his rule, and his building projects. Herod built actually over 20 sites in Israel. In addition to that, he built 13 sites outside of its borders. In these building programs, one of the most famous is his renovation of the Temple of Jerusalem, and this is the second temple period. The first temple was destroyed when the Babylonians conquered Judea. Herod was part Jew. However, his love for things Roman was reflected in his building projects. He was all about all sorts of Roman things, and you could see that repeated over and over again. He was fascinated with the Roman buildings, and he had been to Rome several times. Herod's reign is divided into 3 sectors. Part 1 is his establishment of power. The second part is a focus on these incredible construction buildings that he does throughout the land. And then in his third part of his reign, it sort of devolves into a reign of terror. There's a lot of jealousy, there's rivalry. He's concerned about individuals trying to overthrow them. There's a mental neurosis that takes place in regards to his succession. In fact, he has 2 of his own sons killed. And over time, there's a record that he had 10 different marriages. So you can see here the extent of Herod's kingdom and then how it was divided among his sons after his death. So this territory was ruled by his son Archelaus. This territory here is a territory that was allotted to Herod Antipas. And later, when Archelaus is killed, Herod Antipas is able to rule over both Judea and the area of Galilee. This is the area that's ruled by his son Philip. And then this area is the Decapolis. And so this region is highly Hellenistic. And Jesus travels quite a bit in this area. Herod was considered a client king. He would respond to the orders of the Roman emperor. Now, the sites that Herod chose for his construction projects had very specific characteristics. They were chosen for both political and military reasons, And generally, they are built for very practical reasons also. He would impose his own ideas on Roman architecture. We see examples of this at the Temple Mount, in the construction of the porticos and the outer courts. In his desert palace construction, there's very extravagant and extensive use of large stones. He also used very large stones in public works, and that's to because stones are enduring. The bigger the stone, the longer it's going to endure. And so that was one way of ensuring his own glory and immortality long after he was gone. So you see the use of ashlar stone in particular in these massive building projects. So here's an example of the ashlar stone. As I mentioned, they're massive stones that are used in his public works. There's a light embossing, and that's embossing that refers to this raised portion of the stone, and then very smooth margins, and that allows the stones to be fitted closely together. The course refers to each level of stone. So there were several courses in a building. One stone that was found in a tunnel underneath the Temple Mount measured, so this gives you a sense of how large these stones are, measured 46 feet by 10 feet and by 10 feet in depth, and it weighed over 415 tons. Now, what would you compare that to? So if you took that and compared it to a stone in the pyramid, the stone in the pyramid weighed only 15 tons. A stone at Stonehenge in England weighed 40 tons. So these were incredibly massive stones. The stones, then you might wonder, well, how did they get the stones to these locations? And it's believed that the stones were most likely rolled in on timber logs and then shaped once they arrived on site. Now, in Herod's constructions, he uses a lot of, besides the stones, he also uses a lot of brick, cement, and plaster. In fact, he has a very specific pattern in his brickwork. And so he sets the bricks so that they're in two different patterns. So one is called opus rectaculatum, and that's the diagonal pattern. And then you have opus quadratum, and that's a rectangular horizontal support pattern. And so you see this pattern, and he uses these frequently around doorways and windows. So throughout Israel, this type of brickwork is actually found only in the projects of King Herod. He also uses a lot of frescoes, and he plasters. So on his walls, you see a lot of plaster, which allowed for the painting of these fresco scenes. And again, he's building for practical purposes. And you see the imposition of his own ideas of Roman architecture. You see that like in the Temple Mount, in the outer courts, and in the porticos. That brick pattern allows for the extensive use of plaster upon which he can have these beautiful frescoes painted. So here you can see the different brickwork that I was talking about, both the diagonal and also the horizontal. And as they're used around doorways and windows because they give additional support. This is an example of some of the frescoes, and you can see the brilliant colors that are still remaining in this particular one and the scene. So imagine walking into these massive buildings with these brilliant colors and paintings done on the walls. He used a lot of ornate mosaics on his floors, and unique to Herodian architecture is also the use of circular construction. So again, these are indelible marks that Herod put throughout the land of Israel. You saw these massive buildings with specific stones, use of brickwork, which is unique to Rome, and then you have these circular constructions. So when you see these, you can, these are evidence of buildings that King Herod the Great built. So the circular construction, he integrated this theme of circular temples, which you find in Roman architecture and also in Greek temples. So he models that and brings it into the buildings in Israel. Herod's greatness as a builder and his attitude toward architecture has to focus also on pragmatic issues. Jerusalem is considered the most famous city of the East. It's not just the land of Judea. So he's, how can he improve this and make it something that stands out for all the world to see, including the Emperor of Rome? In his buildings, besides the mosaics, actually in the mosaics, it's made of cut and polished marble, and that's called opus sextile. Here's an example of some of the mosaic flooring. So it's not just stone tiles, but it's actual marble that is cut, polished, and shaped and used on the mosaic floorings. In the museums, you'll find examples of the flooring that they brought up. Look at the detailing here in this mosaic flooring, and thousands and thousands of little pieces put together. A lot of craftsmanship. So one of the key signatures that Herod left for the people of Israel was he renovated and expanded the holy place of worship of the Jews, and that was the temple in Jerusalem. And it's the Second Temple period. The process of renovation took 46 years, and it was actually ongoing during the time of Jesus. And we read about that in the Gospel of John, chapter 2, verse 20. The wall enclosing the temple platform, just to give you a sense of how massive the temple was, covered over 35 acres. So this Second Temple period refers to that time of Zerubbabel and Ezra, and you find references to it in the book of Ezra, chapter 3, and also in 2 Chronicles. It tells us about the beginning of the rebuilding of that Second Temple. Here we have an aerial view of the Temple Mount. What you see before you here, now this of course is the remnants of what was left after the Romans destroyed Jerusalem in 70 CE. So what was built on top of what they believe was part of the Holy Temple is the Dome of the Rock. So it's a Muslim shrine which supposedly sits on the rock, the Muslims believe, from which Abraham was going to sacrifice Isaac. Jews believe this too. So it's a holy place for Jews, Christians, and Muslims. And for the Muslim community, they believe that Muhammad actually ascends to heaven from this spot. For Islam, that rock of sacrifice of Isaac is actually located in Mecca. So here you see the remnants of the wall of the Temple Mount. It also gives you a sense of the topography of Jerusalem. It's very rocky and hilly slopes. Here's a model of what the Temple Mount would have looked like when it was completed. So what Herod did, some of the key features that was added to the Temple Mount is he extended the temple by extending platforms out onto the slopes, particularly the north, the south, and the west. As I showed you in that earlier picture, it's on a very mountainous and hilly type of terrain. So, and overlooking valleys. In order to support the platforms, Herod had these massive arches built, some of which are referred to later on as Solomon's stables, as an area where Solomon would have housed his horses. And we'll talk about that a little bit further on in the presentation. The southern pinnacle is a possible site which is considered to be where Jesus was tempted by Satan, and that's referenced in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 4, verse 9. The triple gate is located in the southern wall, and we'll look at the ashlar stones that's made of. the double gate is also located in the southern wall. So jointly, the gates are referred to as the Hulda gates. So those arches that I talked about were actually not Solomon's stables, but what happened is later the Crusaders and then the Ottomans used the area for their horses. The eastern side, there's no need, they're actually unable to build it out because it actually overlooks the Kidron Valley. So here you have the southwest pinnacle, and this is the suggested location where Jesus was tempted by Satan while he was in the desert for 40 days, one of those temptations. And here you have the base of that southern wall, and it's 28 courses of stone. So remember, I told you it's 48 feet for each one of those ashlar stones in terms of height. So 28 courses, and that gives you a sense of how high it is. It's about 128 feet above the bedrock foundation that it begins. And then you have those courses. Here we have the two sets of gates referred to as the Hulda gate. So you can think of the masses coming in at the pilgrimage festivals such as Passover and Booths. And so they're all entering up through these gates. So you can see the massive expanse of stairwells here to let the people in and the gates. So this is what's referred to as Solomon Stable. You see the massive arches that were built by Herod to support the platforms. And so the stables weren't used by Solomon, but were actually used by the Crusaders and the Ottomans, because that temple that Solomon built was destroyed by the Babylonians. So this is now that second temple period built after the Babylonian exile. So during the time of Herod, they would have had shops set up in this area, catering to those people who are coming to visit the temple. Another view of Solomon's gates. They're very impressive. Now, the area south of the temple, in order to gain access to the temple area, Herod actually built a massive paved road, 21 feet in width, and it includes a very large stairway that leads up to and from those double gates. In order to accommodate all those people, the pilgrims that are coming for the Jewish religious festivals, Herod also built large ritual bath complexes, mikvots, to accommodate the crowd so that they could go through the purity rituals that they needed to in order to enter into the holy temple grounds. All had to enter into the baths before they could enter into the temple. The complex itself has extensive underground tunnels, and so we'll take a look at the mikvots in more detail further on in the presentation. Here's the remains of the paved road, which is 21 feet wide. And it's a close-up of the stairs at the southern gates leading into the southern gates. Just imagine Jesus going up and down here as a child when his parents came for pilgrimage, and think of the masses that came yearly pilgrimage to the Holy Temple site. Here we have the steps to an ancient mikvah. That's the Jewish purity baths. And what would happen is you would enter down one way, enter into the bath, and then you would come up the other way so you wouldn't defile yourself by getting impure again by touching anything on the side that you entered in. And all your clothes would be changed out. There's an emphasis on ritual purity before entering a holy place. Even today, for holy events such as Shabbat or Yom Kippur, complete bathing takes place in a separate facility. So your hair, nails, everything, everything has to be cleaned so that the living water can enter into all parts of your body. So you're fully cleaned before you actually immerse yourself into the mikvot. And once you go into the mikvot, that immersion is 3 times, and specific prayers are recited as before each immersion process. The water is today at a comfortable temperature. Back then it would be the living spring water, so quite cold, I'm sure. And so what you're looking at here again is another entrance into a mikvot. Remember back in the ancient days, this would have all been built up and covered, so it wouldn't have been like this out in the open. Continuing on some of the key features of the Temple Mount. West of the Temple Mount, we have Main Street, and that's constructed again by Herod. And Main Street is actually 41 feet wide, and it runs along the western wall. Now, of course, all these mikvots, these ritual baths, and all these people, these pilgrims coming in and swelling the population need access to water. So beneath this entire area is a large Herodian aqueduct. 4 gates and arches have been located throughout this region. The gates, if you notice, they have very Anglican names, are actually named after the archaeologist or explorer that discovered and excavated the gate. So you have Robinson's Arch, Wilson's Arch, Warren's Gate, and Barclay's Gate, which is near the women's section by the western wall, which is also called the Wailing Wall. So here we've got Wilson's Arch. And you can see this is a portion of the western wall. And you can see the Ashlar Stones here. This gives you a sense of the western wall during a religious festival or gathering, and all the people coming to pray before this wall, the remnant of the Holy Temple. Those arches that we find throughout the Temple Mount, they're extensive, and we have shops were located beneath them to supply the needs of those that were coming to the temple. The royal porch that Herod builds includes 162 Corinthian columns, and they're designed upon a Roman motif. That eastern wall expansion, as I mentioned earlier, was limited by the Kidron Valley. The Golden Gate that's located in the eastern wall was actually built during the Byzantine era. Today, the actual location of the Temple Mount is probably 100 yards north of the Dome of the Rock. Herod didn't relocate the temple, but he renovated the existing second temple from the time of Zerubbabel in the 6th century CE. And that took place under King Cyrus the Great of Persia and the Cyrus Cylinder Decree, which allowed for people to repatriate into their homelands and practice their own faith and cultural norms. So it was a gesture of goodwill on the part of the Emperor Cyrus the Great. This is the Golden Gate, which is located on the eastern wall, the one that overlooks the Kidron Valley, and it was constructed during the Byzantine era. Now, built along the northern wall of the temple, we find the Antonia Fortress, and it's considered to be the possible location of the judgment pavement of Jesus, as spoken about in the Gospel of John, chapter 19, verse 13. Another possible location of that judgment pavement is considered the Herodian Palace, which today is referred to as the Citadel. Herod named the fortress after his patron, Mark Antony, who was a Roman politician and a general. Mark Antony was instrumental in helping secure Herod's reign and recognizing him as the Jewish national leader. So here we have the remains of the Antonia Fortress. And this is this is a model of what the Antonia Fortress would have looked like during the time of Herod. And this roof that you see here was actually a walkway along which the Roman soldiers could march and look down into the temple grounds to make sure that things were remaining calm, particularly when the masses came in. Now, Herod built an expansive palace in Jerusalem for when he was there. The palace had 3 towers, which he named after family and friends, Hippicus, Basil, and one of his wives, Mariamna. When General Titus destroyed the temple and captured Jerusalem in 70 CE, he left one of the towers standing as a sign of his good fortune. So Pilate would actually normally stay at the palace, which was far more luxurious than the fortress. The Faisal Tower is still standing today. So here we have the remnants of Herod's Western Palace, what is referred to as the Citadel today. You can see the Faisal Tower there in the background. And here's an interior view of what remains of the Western Palace. Herod's building projects in Jerusalem included, of course, accommodating an ever-expanding population. The Temple Mount had 37 underground chambers. Most were actually reservoirs, which could hold up to 10 million gallons of water. So just think of the numbers of peoples that are coming that you would need this much water, not only to drink, but for all those bathing that takes place. So he built cisterns, and he also had several pools built to maintain the water supply. So we have the Gihon Spring, the Pool of Siloam, the Pool of Hezekiah. All of these we hear about in the New Testament. And the sheep pool, which John, is mentioned in the Gospel of John in chapter 5, verse 2, and the double Struthion Pool. So the temple needs a lot of water because of the continuous sacrificial rituals. There's a lot of blood that takes place with the sacrifice of the animals, and it needs to be washed away, along with water needed for bathing. And the population estimate for Jerusalem is approximately 100,000, which swells at the festivals, and they estimate close to 1 million would arrive during these high holy days. So here we have a pool that's fed by the Gihon Spring. This is Hezekiah's tunnel. It was built during the Old Testament times under King Hezekiah, and it would have been built 700 during his defense against the Assyrians. And what it allowed was the access of water while the city was under siege. We have the Jerusalem Pool, the Pool of Bethsaida. And what you can see here is the remnants of the pool by the sheep gate. The Pool of Siloam. And the Struthion Pool. Now, Josephus writes that Herod built a theater, a hippodrome, and an amphitheater also in Jerusalem in order to keep the masses entertained, which is something that the Romans did when they built their cities, which we talked about in our last presentation. In Jerusalem, there is no evidence of any such buildings. If there were such facilities that were built, they probably would have been built outside of the city and most probably south of Jerusalem between the valleys. Josephus is a Jewish historian of that time. He was a general during the war, and that was the war when Rome was fighting the Israelites, and it ended up with the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE. Somewhere during that war, Josephus switched sides to the Romans. So many Jews consider him a traitor, but he kept records and histories and accounts of everything that happened to the Jewish people. It would be unlikely that Herod actually would have built a theater, a hippodrome, and an amphitheater within the city of Jerusalem, because it would have been found offensive to that population of conservative and pious Jews. So again, most likely if there were such buildings, they would have been outside of the city, because Herod was anxious to appease the Jewish people and have them accept him as a Jew and as their king. Herod's family tomb is located northwest of the Damascus Gate. It's a circular building with concentric walls. It's unique, again, to Herod. That's a signature construction piece of architecture of Herod the Great, unique at that time in Israel. It uses that brickwork, which I mentioned earlier, of opus recticulatum and quadratum. You find that pattern around the doors and the windows. The tomb is very similar to that of Augustus, the Emperor Augustus in Rome. Herod actually dies in Jericho, and he has himself buried in Herodium. It took many years, but the location has finally been discovered of Herod's tomb. So this is the entryway into Herod's family tomb. And here's a schematic of what that tomb would have looked like, and a model of what it would have looked like upon completion. Now we're going to take a look of Herodian construction outside of the holy city of Jerusalem. So Herod had over 21 building activities that took place in Israel besides Jerusalem. But in this presentation, we're only going to look at 6 of them. We're going to take a look at the Herodium, Jericho, Masada, Caesarea Maritima, Samaria, and Hebron. Now the Herodium is built on a 40-acre site, and it houses the burial site of Herod. Josephus tells us this is where Herod was buried. The Herodium is a desert palace fortress. It was built in 23 BCE, and it's the 3rd largest palace in the Roman world at the time it was built. It looks like a volcano. It's a man-made cylindrical structure that was built specifically for defensive purposes. So remember, he always built for practical reasons, not only for the drama of the building itself. It's a double-walled facility, and inside the wall there are 7 stories that are built into it with quarters that people could live in and life took place. That double wall type of building architecture is also called a casement, and it allows for strengthening a given structure for additional storage, and also provides for escape tunnels. In terms of who had the largest palace at the time, Hadrian, the Emperor Hadrian, had the largest, followed by the Emperor Nero. So let's take a look at where the Herodium is. So the Herodium is right here outside of Jerusalem. So depending on where you are in the city of Jerusalem, you can look and see the Herodium. And it's because it looks like a volcano, you can't miss it because it's such a unique architectural design. Here we have an aerial view of the Herodium and an interior of what that palace remains look like. This is from the ground up, looking upward. And a close-up of some of the ruins. Now this area here was a dining hall, and later apparently was converted into what they believe was one of the earliest synagogues. The site at the Herodium includes a rectangular outdoor garden, a very large triclinium, that's the dining hall, which was later converted into a synagogue by the Jewish zealots during the fall of Jerusalem. The palace has a full Roman bath, and in order to support the Roman bath and the population at the Herodium, Herod had 4 underground cisterns built to capture water. There's a very large course on the site, which was probably used for Herod's funeral parade. The course is quite large, more for a parade ground because it's not large enough to be a hippodrome, which was where the chariot races took place. So here's a model of what the palace would have looked like. You can see the living quarters, the Roman baths, these different towers, the courtyard. This is that double wall, and of course you can walk along the wall, and the reception hall. So here we have a royal theater box for entertainment, and notice the beautiful frescoes that are on the walls. Plaster and fresco. Here's remains of the Roman bath at the Herodium. You can see the hypocauste floorings underneath, which we talked about in our last lecture. And so that's the heating system, which allows hot air and steam to circulate beneath the flooring. So that would have been used in the thermi room. You can see the beautiful tile work and frescoes here. On site was also a very large pool lake, which was a reflection of the decadence and the luxury that you found typical in Roman culture. So water is brought to this fortress by aqueduct from the city of Artis, and that's 4 miles to the west. Herod's tomb was located at the site in 2007. So here's one of those escape tunnels in the Herodium Tunnel. It's a Herodium. And here's a close-up of the ancient triclinium, which was later converted into one of the earliest and oldest known synagogues. And these are stone shells that were actually used for defense of that fortress palace. At the lower level of the Herodium, you find an ancient Byzantine church that's actually cut into the grounds there. The next site we're going to look at is Jericho. Jericho is located 14 miles east of Jerusalem, and it became the location of Herod's winter palace because the climate is substantially warmer than that found in Jerusalem. Another name for Jericho, the Arab name, is Tulul Abu el Alayik, and that's what is referred to today. Herod actually died in the city of Jericho, and then had his body was then transported to the Herodium. So when Herod builds his winter palace, he builds it up in 3 different areas. What he does is he rebuilds what was already on site, which was an ancient Hasmonean palace left from the time of the Maccabees. He rebuilt what was there, a sunken garden, and he includes a round hall, and then he expands, and it's a quite impressive winter palace. So here we have the location of Jericho, 14 miles from Jerusalem, a very steep drop from Jerusalem down to Jericho. The winter palace included a triclinium with beautiful mosaic flooring. It included a circular Roman bath, which had 5 rooms, similar to the one that we'll find in Masada. And north of the palace, he built a hippodrome and a theater, and we do have remains for that. We also see that signature pattern of Herod's architecture, which includes that brick pattern of quadratum and reticulatum. So here we go. Here's Herod's northern palace in Jericho, and you can see that specific brickwork. Notice the round rooms here. the dining area in the northern palace. This is the remains of the ancient palace pool, and it's Josephus writes that his brother-in-law, Herod's brother-in-law, Aristobulus III, was actually drowned in the pool at the age of 17. He was considered to be a rival to Herod. Notice the depth of the pool. So in the reception hall, you see these imprints. Those are imprints that are the remains of the mosaic tile flooring that was in place. And frequently that mosaic is removed and you can see it in museums. But you can see the pattern and the imprint of the flooring, of that mosaic flooring. And columns would have been on either side here. Now you're looking at the Hippodrome and the theater complex that Herod built. So the Hippodrome would have been in front, and behind us here you see the theater complex. This is the remains of the ancient bathhouse. Notice that circular pattern. Again, the influence of Roman architecture seen in Herod's building structures, and that unique signature of his with the brickwork. Our next site is Masada. And Masada is a desert fortress which is located on the west side of the Dead Sea. So when Herod plants these buildings, these fortresses and these palaces, he has multiple uses, specifically defending and overseeing those caravan routes and routes where invaders can come in. So there's dual purposes for everything that he builds. He's making a statement, he's showing his power, but he's also maintaining defensive posture of the territory that's been given to him. So Masada is built on a rise, which is 1,380 feet above the Dead Sea. And it's actually built over an ancient previous structure. In 73 CE, when Jerusalem and Israel came under Roman siege, it is to Masada that 960 Jewish zealots escaped and that included men, women, and children. And they stayed there until finally it fell to the Romans. It took quite a bit of time. They were laid siege, but instead of turning themselves over to the Romans and be subjected as slaves or murdered, they took matters into their own hands and committed mass suicide. So Masada has stood for the Jewish people. It's a symbol of freedom and that desire that they wanted to remain free, and the lengths to which they would go to maintain their freedom. So now we have the location of Masada. Notice where it is in relation to the Dead Sea. So it's a very dry, hot area where Masada is built. And then it's on top of that, it's far above the sea level. Here we have an aerial view of Masada. What you're looking at here, what you can see here is the ramparts of the Roman soldiers that were built in order to get into and take hold of Masada. And this is a footprint of one of the Roman military camps that was stationed around Masada as they struggled to break in and defeat the Jews that were located there. A desert fortress which could oversee invaders or anyone coming in and out of the land. And it was built at many strategic levels going up onto the top of this mountain. So massive retaining walls are built, and it creates this impression of a Roman villa, and the residence where the king would reside was at the very top. The site includes a circular pavilion, a public bath for all those individuals that are there to support Herod and his family, large storerooms, and also an administrative center, because when Herod was on site, he would bring his entire entourage with him. The residence, which is located at the top level, is situated so that it's protected from the southern winds, which apparently were very strong. And the floors are made with beautiful black and mosaic white tiles. Again, another signature mark of Herodian architecture. So here you have the remains of the Masada-Bath. And if you get an opportunity to actually go and visit the site, you'll see some of the frescoes that are still remaining on the wall. You can see the Hippocaust where we're bringing in the warm water. All this stuff has to be brought up from great distances in order to provide all these luxuries for the king. This is the hot room, the Colidarium, the bathhouse. And in addition to the Roman bath, he also had his mikvah, which is that ritual purity bath. So here you have your mikvah. Now, in order to bring water to this complex, Herod actually had a dam built, and he uses 2 aqueducts, and he has 12 large reservoirs built to hold water. So any drop of rain is captured. That synagogue, a synagogue is actually found. It's built or redesigned by the Jewish zealots who resided there as they tried to defend Masada against the Roman invaders. It's found along the western wall, and it may have also originally been a triclinium, a dining room. And it's also considered one of the oldest synagogues in Israel, along with the one that we saw in Herodium and another that's in Gamla. So here's an image of that synagogue that's in Masada, which again was probably used originally as a dining room. Here's an aerial view. And these are some of the storage facilities, what you're looking at here, where they would have kept the food and the grains for the people. And this is the Dovecot in Masada. So dovecots are also called columbariums. The doves serve multiple purposes, and it's what helped kept the zealots alive during the siege by the Romans. The doves are actually raised and eaten for their meat. All parts of them are used. Their feathers are used for bedding. The eggs and the shells are important for making plaster, and the egg yolks are actually used for paints and glaze used for the frescoes. So doves were an important asset for people in the ancient world. And this is an extensive dovecot. Here we see some examples of the beautiful mosaic flooring that's in Masada. If you have the opportunity to visit Masada, they have a fabulous museum before you actually enter into the site that you take a tour of, and you can see items that they found on site remaining there. Because it's a desert site, everything was very well preserved, and after it was taken over by the Romans, it was left deserted for hundreds of years. Nobody traveled that extent and went up there, so they were able to find combs and brushes and shoes and clothing, different items from those Jews that harbored there as a place of refuge from the Romans. Our next site now is Caesarea Maritima, and this city was critical for providing a large amount of revenue for all of these building projects of Herod. So he needed to build a port. So Caesarea Maritima is a brand new port which Herod builds from the ground up. And it's located on the coast between Tel Aviv and Haifa. It covers about 164 acres. And Herod's genius, again, comes forward in how he builds this. It's built with limestone. He has a beautiful palace he locates there, and he builds a swimming pool. He has a theater. And the building of Caesarea Maritima began in 23 BCE. It took 10 to 12 years to complete. So Caesarea Maritima is located here along the coast. The other piers cities with ports would have been Tyre and Sidon, but Herod wanted something of his own so that he could claim the tariff and the taxes of the goods that would come in and out of having his own port city. Here we have an aerial view of the port. And the theater located at Caesarea Maritima. Herod engineered the first artificial harbor in the ancient world. And he was able to do this by the extensive use of hydraulic concrete. In other words, he was able to design and come up with concrete that hardens underwater, so they could put it in place and build forward from that. His harbor was formed by 2 breakwaters. It provided a 60-foot wide entrance, and it included an inner quay and 2 loading docks that they have found at this point in time. A large amount of tonnage came through the harbor. In fact, so much so that it has to be stored. And to give you a sense of it, at least 100 vaults have been located along the coast to store the quantity of how well used that particular port city was. So here we have the promontory of Herod's palace, the remains of his palace. And this is the pool that was found in his palace. And it's believed that the Apostle Paul was kept prisoner here as a Roman citizen. And no doubt we know that he could swim. He may have learned how to swim here, if not earlier. Here's an example of some of the tile flooring that's found at the palace in Caesarea. Now, in order to meet the needs of the new city, Herod needed to build an extensive aqueduct to bring fresh water in. And so he uses clay pipe, and it's set into concrete, and it runs through the aqueduct. But in this case, no part of the clay pipe was actually open to the elements. So that water that was brought in was kept as clean as possible. The city also included a theater, an amphitheater, and a hippodrome, again, modeled after the Roman cities, how best to meet the needs of the population. And the aqueduct, the water is moved through the aqueduct by gravity. So here we have some examples of portions of the aqueduct that remain standing. So the pipe is completely covered that runs through here. Again, massive stonework. Here you have an aerial view of the Hippodrome, also known as the circus, and this is where the chariot races would have taken place, with an incredible view out to the water there. You can see the theater back in here, and the palace was located in this area. Then you have this complex of warehouses to accommodate all the tonnage that's being brought in. And this is an example of one of the vaults located in Caesarea Maritima. Some of these vaults were actually later used as gathering and worship places by early Christians. Also, they were used as cultic worship places for Roman deities. Our next site is the Hellenistic city of Samaria, also known as Sebaste, and it was renamed Sebaste. It's built as a fortress. It's surrounded with strong walls. 2 of the towers remain standing today. So what Herod did was he rebuilt that city. The stonework in the towers uses that signature Ashlar Stone. So you have the large bosses with the smooth margins. It had a very impressive road leading into the city, which is bordered by 600 columns as you're coming in. On the city Acropolis was found the remains of a temple built to honor the Emperor Augustus. So here we have the city of Sebaste-Samaria. And you have a picture of the columns that would have lined the road leading into that ancient city. So on the site, we have Corinthian style basilica. So that means that the columns have that Corinthian, very ornate design on the columns. It's next to the basilica, you find a rectangular forum. Again, Herod is following the design of buildings using the Roman architecture style. There's a large stadium that is built inside the city wall. And so Herod is looking at meeting the needs of all of his population, not just the Jewish population, but the Gentile population, the Roman population. Samaria has everything you would expect in a Western civilization of the Roman Empire. It has temples, it has a theater, it has a forum, colonnaded streets, and a stadium. So here we have the remains of one of the ancient temples in Samaria and the theater. And now we're looking down upon the forum, which was the marketplace, a place of social gathering, and also business takes place here. Now remember, if we were looking at a Greek agora, it would be square, and the Romans made it rectangular. Our next site is the city of Hebron. We're going to look at the cave of Machpelah. So what Herod built here was this incredible monumental wall to protect the cave of Machpelah, which was the tomb of the patriarchs and matriarchs. It's the burial place of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and their wives, Sarah, Rebecca, and Leah. Rachel wasn't born there because she died in childbirth, having Benjamin out in the desert. The wall is the same style and type as the wall that we find in the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. So he would have used that Ashlar stone. So here we have Hebron, which, if you notice in this map, is in the West Bank area. That's what the wall looks like as you approach it through the steps. Again, a very massive site. So the tomb of the patriarchs was bought by Abraham, and we find this referenced in the book of Genesis. It's the first purchase of land, so it's a marker of God's promise. So it's the first purchase of land in the promised land of God. So you find a reference to that action that takes place in Genesis 23, verses 1 through 20, where Abraham goes to the city gate to make that purchase. So the cave itself of Machpelah is within the city gate. So here we are looking down into the cave. It's an ancient double cave. It's been worshipped as the site of the burial site of Abraham since 1000 BCE. And it's considered the second holiest site in Judaism after the Western Wall that we see in Jerusalem. These are some of the excavations that are taken place in regards to the site in Hebron. So Herod's message with his massive building projects, what the image he's trying to portray, it's one of domination, in contrast to Jesus, which is that of servitude in the kingdom of God. So Herod provides us with facades and hierarchy, where people stand in relation to power, versus Jesus is all about sincerity and equality in the kingdom of God. So Jesus's teachings undermine that message of the Roman Herodian power and might. So that brings us to the end of this third presentation. So in our next presentation, we'll be looking at Jesus and Galilee and Judea. But hopefully, as we've been working through these presentations, you really began to understand and appreciate the world in which God would bring his son into, and what are the different elements and factions that are in place, including the importance of understanding and the relevance of architecture and archaeology for helping us better understand that world and the different tensions that resulted in the lives of the people at that time. So some reflection questions. Do you think Herod's building programs were reassuring for the Jews, or were points of contention? And if so, why? List at least 2 positive and 2 negative possible outcomes with the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem. Besides financial gain for Herod, what benefits could early Christians gain from a vibrant Caesarea Maritima? All right then, God bless you, and thank you very much for joining me in this presentation today.